welcome to the panel that they had to add an extra hour onto Comic-Con to make sure that we could accommodate that. Thank you for spending the dying hours of your Comic-Con 2025 with us to celebrate the life and legacy of one of the all-time greats, not only in our industry, but in all of 20th century arts, letter, and culture, and also a big part of 21st century, and that is Jules Feiffer. Comics is pretty good at celebrating people who are in our pantheon of stars, but I think that very few people is the gap between their reputation inside the world of comics and their actual body of achievement in the world at large as great as it is with Jules Feiffer. Which we can discuss in here at Comic-Con in the context of being an awesome cartoonist, a pioneer of graphic novels and extended form narratives in comics, but his entire body of achievement is so much wider than that. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I am a writer and sayer of things about comics. I write for Forbes and ICD2 and Publishers Weekly, and I just did a long essay on Jules Feiffer's work in the context of mid-century design and culture, and also his great book, The Great Comic Book Heroes, for the Comics Courier, which is going to be coming out in a couple of weeks. Unlike everybody else on this stage, I never met Jules Feiffer in person, but his legacy has been with me since I was a kid, because like a lot of people, I encountered his gorgeous illustrations in the Phantom Toll Booth. I delightedly got for Hanukkah one year The Great Comic Book Heroes, which, how many other people in this room was that book your entry point into the fact that there was a golden age of comics, right? That there was a history to comics before we started reading them. As a teenager in the 80s, reading his satirical work in The Village Voice, he was giving me permission to voice my own intuition that maybe this Reagan guy was not so right, and maybe the stuff that was going on was not okay, and that you could be smart and artistic and funny about how you perceive the world around you. So he was a wake of initiation into political consciousness for me as a young teenager. In the drama club when I was in high school, I was reciting monologues from The Little Herders. Of course, I loved Popeye, and then discovered his work as a graphic novelist also. So he has been with me throughout my entire life as a comics fan. But for these guys, they have all known him and been studying various aspects of his legacy. So we have on the illustrious panel Gary Groth, publisher of Fantagraphics, and publisher also of some of Feiffer's work through all aspects of his career. We have Paul Levitz, who is, of course, not only legendary writer and publisher and president and all of the things at DC, but is here in this capacity also as a biographer of Will Eisner, who was, of course, where Jules Feiffer got his start. Pretty good place to get your start. We have Karen Green, who is the comics librarian at Columbia University, who can not only talk to aspects of Feiffer's career in arts and letters, but also knew him and saw him around New York and did all sorts of things. And then finally we have Peter Kuper, himself an incredibly accomplished cartoonist, political satirist, graphic novelist, protege of Feiffer, and somebody who has created a graphic presentation to walk us through the highlights of Feiffer's career. So, Peter, why don't you take it away from now?
So, is this working? Yes. Okay. So, just so everybody has a little context, if you don't have it already. So, Feiffer grew up on the comics, and then he happened to he had this uncanny ability to just like be at the right place at the wrong time or the right time. And he did this, he went to the Korean War, and he came out of that with this cartoon Monroe about a 4-year-old who gets drafted, and they don't realize that he's 4. And it ended up winning the Academy Award because it was coupled with Breakfast at Tiffany's. I think that was in 1961. And then he, as a 17-year-old, he approached Will Eisner, went down to the studio and said, you know, he basically did a combination of telling telling Eisner how much he loved his work and telling him what, you know, like he was going off the rails a little bit with the spirit, and he got hired as part sycophant and part, he ended up being a writer for the spirit. Then he happens to be living in the same building as Norton Juster, who gets a grant from the Ford Foundation to do something completely different, and comes out with Phantom Tollbooth and says, hey, you want to illustrate that, pal? And he was like, huh, looks good, and it turns into a classic. He did his drawings on tracing paper, and they all crumbled and disappeared, sadly. Then he's at the Village Voice. He sees the Village Voices come out, and he's like trying to figure out where his place in things, and he approaches them very early on in 1956, and they give him a slot for no pay, and that goes on for 8 years. But he produces from that a book, Sick, 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 among other things, and that became Sick Humor. Actually, the term came from Feiffer. Then he slips into being a playwright. You know, he kind of, the way he sort of moved around, like, yeah, I think, well, I'll try doing that. He went to Yaddo, which is this retreat where I think he wrote Little Murders. And people who saw his comics said, they're not comics, they're more like plays. And then when he did his plays, they said, yeah, they're not really plays, they're more like comics. He griped.
Really?
And then, you know, he wrote the Great Heroes, the superhero comic book, and he was moving through these different things. And then I met him when he was started to do children's work. He just started, and actually Gary wanted to publish an early strip that he had done called Clifford, which he did before Peanuts, and it was a kid's strip, and you were going to print that, and I went over to, I used it as an excuse to go to his apartment, pick up the original art, and take it to be scanned.
Really? I don't remember that.
Yeah, and it was great. I mean, I had he's like, here you go, and I'm like carrying around all these amazing strips, which, I mean, Clifford was in part of the spirit. Yeah, it was in the spirit, but it predates Peanuts, and it was really, you know.
Did you ship those to us?
No, I didn't. I actually took them to a place and scanned them, and then I was later informed that all the scans were crap.
Well, you had scanned at that
It was
at
a
that time. That was
Velox.
What's that?
Velox.
Yeah.
It was something like that. I mean, not scan. It was there was something. It was They were like being photographed. Yeah, it was something. Yeah, it was a long time ago. So, but then he proceeded to. So he moved out of. He decided that the strip he was doing for the Village Voice was adults were not getting it. He had changed the world as he had hoped, and so he turned to children. Figured I'll get them earlier, and did these amazing things. And very subtle plug for my own book there. You'll see. So then he's like, then he morphs again and turn around, and he's comes out with a trio of graphic novels. Kill My Mother was the first of them, and a trilogy. And he was originally looking for another artist to draw it, because he said he wanted to do this noir thing, and then he was like, hey, I could do it myself, and proceeded to do it. And then he came out with Amazing Grapes. I guess last fall that came out, and that was a remarkable sort of somewhere between children's book as an adult and something a little bit like Phantom Tollbooth in its own way. And I visited him pretty recently, and he gave me this advice, so and which I'm trying to follow. So there's some of his early Feiffer strips, and he was playing around with different styles, and he was trying to do. Clifford was a lot tighter, and then he just found this much looser style. And I don't know whether he looked at Shel Silverstein or not, but it's different. And also, he probably looked at a lot of early comic strips. And The Dancer is another one.
I think it was Silverstein and Steig and Osborne that influenced.
Right.
It was not Dreyfus, sorry.
All together.
Yeah.
and Scribbler was a big important. Yeah, Shelley Mayer. So these are a couple of things. And I found some associated work that through time that seem quite related. There's like Crazy Cat, now using panel borders and all that, which it was very revelatory at the time that he did it. And even, the dancing figure, hey, keep on dancing. And I know that Tom was influenced by, Love Feiffer. So this is in the later years here.
But Feiffer did not look pro.
No, he did not at all. Or Mad Magazine, or a lot of things I loved. Like, what next? The Three Stooges?
Well, that's just good.
That's just good taste. So I went up and visited him, and here he is. He's signing a book that Charlie Kochman published at Abrams, and he's going along. Charlie was sitting next to me, and he does the whole book, and then he said, and it's my book, and he writes, to Charlie, and I was like, Jules, that's my book, and he goes, to Bob, to Peter, and then he signs it, Rube Goldberg, Jules Feiffer, and he did this, took this little error that I was like, oh, and then turned it into, oh, there's the genius, and I love it. This is a little cartoon he did for me, just a couple months before he died. As it so happens, there he is with a stack of his upcoming book, License to Fail. I mean, it's literally 250 pages. He's drawing it, and as you can see, he has not lost his teeth. He was doing like a drawing a day for a couple of years here, and I think in some ways it's his best work. It's like this remarkable drawing. Just gotta draw. And as I dedicated my upcoming book to him, and said that he's the Fred Astaire of political cartooning.
So in the spirit of that wonderful personal reminiscence, I'd actually invite the other panelists to share either your first or your most memorable encounter with Jules. Let me start with Gary.
Okay, let me see. I think I met Jules around 1987. And the occasion would have been that I did a long interview with him for the Comics Journal. It would often be the case that I approached people I admired, interviewed them in the Comics Journal, and then sometimes I got to know them on a deeper level later. So I remember, let me see, actually I think it was, I would have been on the West Coast. I would have moved to LA by then. So I stayed at a friend's place, and I took the train in to Manhattan like 2 or 3 days in a row, and went to Jules's place, and we sat down for a couple of hours every day and did the interview, and then after the interview we sat around and talked, or we might have gone out to dinner. And then I published that interview in the journal, and that really started a friendship, and I proposed that we do a series of books called the Collected Works of Jules Feiffer, which I wanted to do from the very beginning of his career in from his drawing from 1951, something like that, and just collect everything he did. And he was excited about that. So that necessitated me going back to his place and going through his hodgepodge of archives, which he had. He had tons of original art in these bins in his studio. And I remember sitting on the floor, cross-legged, just going through piles and piles of art and sorting, and he didn't really even know what he had. And I just sorted it all out. I spent, several days in his studio sorting it out. I seem to remember taking the original art with me because the art had to be shot with a camera, which we had. A giant art camera that you shot and made stats from, and that's from what you printed from. And I think I took all that art back with me, which now retroactively terrifies me.
Me too.
Yeah. And anyway, so we always, we had a great, it was my good fortune to get to know Jules personally, and we always had a good time. I spent a lot of time in his Upper West Side apartment. He was, you know, he was always welcoming and always incredibly gregarious for someone who seemed to have so much pressure on him to do things. I mean, he had a strip, he was writing plays, he always seemed to have about 6 different creative irons in the fire. And yet I could call him up, you know, in the middle of the afternoon, ostensibly to ask him a simple question, and then we would have an hour-long conversation. And he didn't seem to mind taking that hour away from whatever he was doing. Went out to dinner with him a lot. Yeah, we had a lot of fun.
Paul, how about yourself?
So, I met the work of Jules Feiffer from the Great Comic Book Heroes. And this came out when I was a kid. It was, in my circle, the most borrowed book from the Brooklyn Public Library, probably the most stolen book from the Brooklyn Public Library. I didn't steal my copy. Eventually, I got my parents to buy it. And then I probably looked at the Phantom Tollbooth at some point, but I have no memory of it connecting into me. Then when I was commuting to high school, one of my buddies was a regular Village Voice reader, and I got to see Jules' work from there, was fascinated by it. I didn't get to know him until I did a book on Will Eisner, and Jules was pretty much the last man standing from the Spirit days. So I was able to get hold of him and sit down with him for an afternoon and just go back in time, talk about that world. And I discovered that, unsurprisingly, this was an extraordinarily intelligent and erudite man with deep points of view on nearly everything. And he could also make a really good tuna salad sandwich. It's nice to have extra skills, right? And we became friendly from that and had a number of other encounters over the years. What I found was that we had many friends in common who we had each gotten to know at the beginning of their careers, at the beginning of our careers. But many of them I encountered more at the end of their careers. Jerry Grandinetti, who started out as an architecture student working in Eisner's studio. By the time I was working with him, he was a well-established comic book artist, people like that. Will, of course. And it was a fascinating, different perspective on the time. It's really hard to overestimate the level of creative intelligence that Jules brought to his work. I've worked with an enormous number of creative people in my life. I can only think of 1 or 2 who I would put remotely in the same class. It's not just the awards he won. The awards are phenomenal and they're fair and they're representative of the diversity of his accomplishment. But this was a guy who was not a master of a medium. He was a master of creativity. And you very, very rarely see that kind of raw intelligence at work. Here's something to think about. How can I change that thing in a way that will make it accessible to people, interesting to people, make it into magic. And it was a joy to watch that mind at work on almost anything. And he could sit there and give you a half hour on the politics of the day. These days, obviously, more than a modicum of disgust. But not just the disgust, a real sense of history and how the things were coming together and why we were in this mess. Maybe how we might be able to start finding our way out of the messes that we were in, and work from there.
Karen, you said you had miles of Jules stories.
Yeah, but I only have a short amount of time, right? So, like you, I first met him through Phantom Tollbooth. I got it as a 10th birthday present. And then, as a teenager in the 70s, not the 80s, I discovered Feiffer and the Village Voice and read it religiously. Between Feiffer and Doonesbury, and the Watergate hearings, that was kind of like my political awakening. And I was mesmerized by his work. but I didn't meet him. Well, actually, the first time I saw him in person, Danny Fingeroth was doing a talk on Eisner and the Spirit at Columbia, and Jules was in the audience. And when Danny got to discussing the story 10 minutes, Jules shouts out, "I wrote that!" And, oh, well, why don't you come down and talk about it? And he kind of took over things from there. Then he was invited back to do another talk by a faculty member at Columbia, whom Paul co-teaches with, actually, to do a talk after his memoir came out, Backing Into Forward. And we all went to dinner afterwards, right? Jules adored this guy. You know, I was never at an event that you were at where he said, like, let's go out, where it's like, no, where's Peter? You know, Peter always had to be part of that.
That's because I like to drink.
No. I got to sit next to him, and that was my first, like, real meeting with him, and it turns out that he and I have a passion for classic Hollywood that's pretty much on par. And so we were talking about old movies and talking about the 1930s and the Chris Ware edited Gasoline Alley volumes had just come out, and Jules was saying, you know, reading it all in a chunk like that, as opposed to one strip a day for infinity, he said, made me realize that Frank King was the first graphic novelist, and Gasoline Alley is the first graphic novel, great American graphic novel. Then he invited me out, I can't even remember why, he invited me out to the house in Southampton. And he was working on Kill My Mother. And we sat there at a table in his living room, and he's like showing me these pages, and I'm drooling. And he said that it was the invention of the brush pen that had made it possible. He had always wanted to draw like Eisner. He never had the skill, which he talks about at length in his own memoir, how Eisner made it very clear that he didn't have the skill. But the brush pen allowed him to manipulate ink in a way that he had never been able to do before, and it was so exciting for him. He had a huge screen television set up in a corner with a couch like 2.5 feet away from it, and he would just sit there and watch old movies. TCM would be on all day long. And we went out to dinner at a diner, and I had to catch the Hampton Jitney back to the city, and we miscalculated the time, and we realized that we had almost no time to get there, and we go tearing through the darkened, rain-shining Southampton streets. I said, I feel like we're out of a Spirit comic. You know,
Jules was driving?
Jules was driving.
Yeah.
This was before the...
One of those high school crash films.
And the bus was just beginning to pull out, and he's like, go, pound on the back of it. And I go, so anyway, happy with him. Then after Kill My Mother came out, the Southampton Museum did a big exhibition of every single page in like a big line around this huge room. So he invited me to come out for that. And we walked around and discussed literally every single page. And I bring up all of these things really to get to this story, which if you read the San Diego 2025 souvenir book in memoriam, I was lucky enough to write the tribute to Jules, and I tell a story, which I will allow you to read because it's free online, about how he told me that my father had no balls, but I had balls. So, you know, when Jules tells you that, you know, that's good. And we ran across each other a lot. You know, there was your event where you interviewed him about the Spirit at the SDA Theater, and there was an event where, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, Neil Gaiman interviewed him at the Second Street Live.
Actually, say
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And geez, but the thing that struck me, in addition to all of the things that Gary and Peter and Paul have talked about, Peter and Paul,
Yes, ma'am.
about his creativity and his breadth. The thing that always struck me most about him was his joy. He had a smile like the smile of an 8-year-old kid seeing his grandfather for the first time in a year. I mean, his whole face would light up, and he would smile, and he would just be so full of joy, which is why this one quote that I remember from a talk about editorial cartooning, that was a quote from Jules. Wait, I'm not going to be able to see this. he said about editorial cartooning, outside of basic intelligence, there's nothing more important to a good political cartoonist than ill will. And the amazing thing is that he was able to balance ill will and joy in such perfect harmony.
That's an excellent point of entry to the next, because there's so much, like, when we're organizing these panels, like, okay, that'll cover the first 3 hours, then what? But since we're at Comic-Con, I want to talk a little bit about his cartooning and his political cartooning. And Peter, I'd like to start with you just about what made his work so uniquely both, accessible and trenchant, and he accomplished an awful lot with very little on the page, right?
Yeah. I think he had his finger on the pulse of sort of the zeitgeist of his time, and he was listening to Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce and Nichols and May, and he's the kinship like snapped immediately, so that he met Nichols and May early on, and they were like, yeah, we're speaking the same language, and it was really that connective tissue that happened. And it kind of happened in underground comics too, and with different groups through time or beats or whatever, but they had that where they made those connections, and he was just right in the center of that. I do want to throw in a couple more stories.
Yeah, please, yeah.
I say he was like Forrest Gump, or he was always like right there at that moment. Zelig, yeah. And one of them, one of the things he did was he did work with Hugh Hefner, who he raved about as being a great editor, actually. Although I'm sure maybe Harvey Kurtzman didn't feel the same with Little Andy Fanny. But that Jules always said, Hefner was an amazing, had a really good eye and made changes and things, and gave him a lot of opportunity. But they were it was like the Chicago Hefner mansion during the 68 Democratic Convention, and he got Hefner to go out into, like, we gotta get out there and see this thing. And they went out there and promptly got like grabbed by the police and like, I think they got like whacked. And he thinks that that's why Hefner like moved out to California. Because he like said, like, come on, let's go. What are you waiting for? Like they're watching TV, and he's like, get off the mountain and go down, mingle with the people. And I saw a picture of one of his, the pipe down, and there was a picture of Jules being arrested at a school protest in New York. He was getting out there and managed to be participating in all these things and keep doing what he was doing and be and be around he was at Elaine's for all this partying that was going on, and it was he had a literati, Woody Allen and Roth was there, and they would be arguing into the night, and he was he was also hanging out with James Baldwin a lot, and he became good friends with name went just out of my head. Beautiful black actor, singer. Harry Belafonte, who lived across the street from him, and they hung out, and he just said he got a lot of the direction he went with his comics, as civil rights was coming along, from hanging out, drinking with James Baldwin, and I asked him about like the pearls of wisdom he got from him, and he was like, "Oh, we were too drunk. I blacked out." So, but at the end, when I visited him most recently, which was just a few months before he died, I did a little interview with him for The Nation magazine, and we were talking about just generally can you make these things move the political dial and all that, and he said, it's just it feels like a lost cause. But he said, like endless battles are endless. That's the deal. You keep on doing that, and they keep happening, and you're trying to move something forward. And he did that in so many ways. There were so many people with his comics, with his political comics, and you know, I hear a lot about the preaching and converting and all that, but like finding Jules Feiffer's work, I didn't like pop out political, nor did any, you know, that's not how it works. You see things that make you think about these things, and then, you know, start, you know, doing your own, you know, lighting your own fires.
He once told me that he didn't think his political cartooning or maybe political cartooning ever changed anyone's mind. And he was okay with that. He said he just had to do it.
You know, I have to draw.
If it hits you at the right stage of life, it can change it can give you permission to think your own thoughts and think you're not the only one who thinks this. And that was kind of a liberating thing. And so we often talk about Harvey Kurtzman opening that door with Mad, and it's like, wow, this stuff I'm not the only one who thinks the adult world is kind of ridiculous and that things in mass culture are worthy of mockery, and that his sense of humor kind of kicked down that door. We think of Charles Schulz as bringing in this sort of sophistication and psychology into the world of kids in Peanuts. Gary, where do you think Feiffer's work fits in comics history in the context of people like that, of kind of elevating the form beyond where it was?
Well, I mean, I think he was seminal because you know, he didn't actually want to be a political cartoonist. He wanted to be a graphic novelist before there was the term or even the concept. And he couldn't be a graphic novelist because nobody would publish him as a graphic novelist. And he did stories. He did Monroe. He did a couple of other things. And he submitted them to publishers, and they all looked at it. According to him, they all looked at it and said, "This is really great. We can't possibly sell this." And so he took the Village Voice gig as a way to make himself known, so that he could become a graphic novelist. But what he did is he injected in the multi-panel strip a level of seriousness and a sophisticated commentary that comics and cartooning really didn't have. You had great political cartoonists. You had people like Art Young and all that, but they were single panel cartoonists. And he used the grammar of comics, the panel-to-panel continuity, to expand on political commentary. And then he went beyond political commentary, and he's talked about relationships. He created characters called Bernard and Huey. Bernard was basically him. Sort of a introverted, neurotic intellectual, and Huey was Stanley Kowalski, who Jules hated, and he did a lot of these strips for Hefner at Playboy, and so he learned how to dramatize, which I think then led him into playwriting. So he introduced those elements into comics, and he did that about 10 years before the underground comics movement really started. So he was kind of a predecessor to underground comics. I know some cartoonists, including Crumb, looked at him and gained inspiration from his work and just recognized, as Rob just said, that you could do this. That this was possible in comics.
So Paul, Gary raises a point that Jules wanted to be a graphic novelist before there was any conception of that, and in fact some of the collections of his earlier work, like 666 and the Explainers and stuff like that, were some of the first comics that were collected in book form on the bookshelf in those paperbacks. In your book, Paul, your Eisner biography, you also include a capsule history of the development of the graphic novel. Where does Jules's work fit in that? And where does he fit in that continuum with stuff like Tantrum and his later work in comparison with Eisner?
The graphic novel is such an awkward term, and it's become our working term for a big, thick story in comics. When I teach it in a lit class, I really try to teach it saying, look, there's genre fiction. There's nothing wrong with genre fiction. It's good junk food. It's most of what I wrote in the course of my career. It's most of what I worked on. It's an awful lot of what I read as a reader. It's fine. It's fairly empty calories. If we're going to judge what the graphic novel is as literature, we should be looking for stories that have to do with the things that humans have been wondering about all their lives, all through history, whether it's morality, mortality, sexuality, religion. When you look to even the short stories that Jules did for The Spirit, we remember as historians or as readers the characters that emerged in the golden age of comics. But there are very few stories that we remember, because the stories were genre fiction by and large. Some exceptions. I don't mean to slight Karl Barks or Beck and Binder, and people who would reach that. But some of those first stories that Feiffer did for Eisner, unsigned, decades before it would be attributed to him, like 10 Minutes, are steps towards the graphic novel as literature. It's about humanity. They're not novels, they're short, very short stories. But in terms of having the courage to talk about more than whether the good guys win, to look at the ambiguities of life. A lot of good literature is about the ambiguity of life. We don't, why do good people have bad things happen to them? Why do the bad guys win? Why does the world work this way? We don't have answers for that. Some people find it in religion. Some people don't find it ever at all. Feiffer was very comfortable looking at all those things from a ridiculously young age. And that's a move towards it. I think he began to move towards exploring what we would recognize as the graphic novel with Tantrum, which comes out very much in the same wave of life as Eisner's Contract with God and other experiments in the late 70s.
When did Tantrum come out?
I think it was about
78.
78. I think it's about 6 months different from Contract. Like Contract, it's a commercial failure. And so Feiffer doesn't go back there again. You know, there's other things. It's cool. Somebody just called me to work on a movie last week. I've got a play I'm cooking. I can do stuff. If nobody's reading that, then why should I try to do another one? But you could see him as part of that wave of, there's something here. We could use this tool to do more. And this was a man who thought. And I don't mean to take away from the other early graphic novelists of that period specifically, but an awful lot of those early graphic novels are just long comic book stories. They're genre fiction. Eisner with Contract, particularly the lead story, the title story in Contract, are asking questions about humanity. In Eisner's case, we didn't know for decades that in fact was about the trauma of his life, about his daughter Alice's death, and that he was projecting that into it. Feiffer didn't need a tragedy in his family to be thinking about this stuff, because Feiffer was thinking about everything. And he was arguing with Eisner from when he was a kid, and he, I think, was arguing with everybody for the entire rest of his life, but not in an ill-intended fashion, not in a querulous fashion. He would love Peter because Peter was interested in the world and was a political preacher, and he could argue with Peter. And it's like, you know, why is this happening? Where is this happening? I think it's this. Do you think it's that? What is the cause? That was the joy of his life. And if he couldn't keep up with it, and most of us could not keep up with him for very long, he'd move on to find somebody else to do it with, whether that was Nichols and May or whoever else in the process. This was an extraordinary intelligence in human form.
So I just got a sign that said that we have like 10 minutes left to discuss like the 80-year career of Jules Feiffer. So I would be remiss just in saying, discussing his comic work, this is a guy who is an Academy Award-winning screenwriter. He won a Pulitzer Prize. He wrote novels. He wrote plays. I would invite any of the panelists to talk about some of his larger cultural footprint outside of the world of comics and what it meant to have somebody that came from the world of comics making that big of a splash outside of our little businesses.
I mean, what it meant to who? The people outside of our business.
What it
didn't know
meant,
that he
what
was
it
a
meant,
comics
what it meant to you
person.
personally, what it meant to him, I don't know, but some larger
I
commentary.
don't
on
think it was about whether it meant anything to anybody. It was just, it's just this outpouring of.
I would argue with your premise, Rob.
Yes.
Jules didn't self-identify as a comic book guy. He didn't self-identify as a comic strip guy. He didn't, I'm not sure he's,
Self-identified, right?
yeah, I'm not sure he's self-identified as anything.
Yeah.
Public intellectual maybe, more than anything else. Not that he denied being a cartoonist or denied the work, but if when Frank Miller got to co-direct Sin City, this was a comic book guy who got to co-direct a movie of his comic book. And that was very exciting to the world of comics because it meant, you mean we could cross that line? Nobody made that same kind of connection with Feiffer, I think.
I think Jules thought of himself as first and foremost a writer. I know that when he started his strip in The Voice, he told me that the drawing was incidental, that he was primarily interested in writing, and that he had to kind of create this style, you know, that would just suit the strip. But then he focused on the writing. And of course that's borne out by, you know, however many plays he wrote. He wrote like 8 or 9 or 10 plays. You know, my first experience with Feiffer actually was not as a cartoonist, but it was watching Carnal Knowledge in a repertory theater around 1971. And it just knocked me for a loop, I'm not sure I even knew a cartoonist wrote it or that Jules Feiffer wrote it, and not even sure I knew, you know, I knew who Jules Feiffer was at that time. But yeah, I think he identified fundamentally as a writer, even though of course he loved comics and cartoons.
I think he was very much a political creature. When he gave his talk after his memoir came out, he co-opted a quote from Mort Saul, comedian Mort Saul, who said that as he was growing up in Brooklyn, his family talked politics endlessly, and he knew all about the Communist Party and the Socialist Party and the Workers' Party, and he was in high school before he ever heard of the Democratic Party and the Workers' Party. And Jules said that was very much how he grew up. He was just immersed in this political dialogue, this political discourse from the time he was sentient. And that is what leads out into everything that he does.
Well, of course, he saw personal relationships in a kind of political way too.
No question.
I mean, I remember seeing he invited me to a debut of a play at Lincoln Center. And it might have been the last play he wrote, I forget the title of it, but it took place in the 50s during McCarthyism.
Bad Friend?
Yeah, but it took place in the 50s. It was engulfed in from McCarthyism.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, a lot of his plays, and he did look at personal relationships through a political prism.
He looked at
Apropos what you
his own
said
personal
about-
relationships.
Apropos what you said about him being a writer first, there was one of his greatest strips that he did for Playboy. It's all black panels with the text, and it's like a couple in bed having sex. And then the closer on it is, you know, they're back and forth thing, and then finally the guy says, you know, I think I love you. And then there's a pause panel, and then the woman says, "You've ruined everything."
Right.
And it just, but it was all writing, and you know, and black panels, and it's like, you know, I think he did move the dial on how people felt about all these different forms that he worked in, and that you know he was doing that all the time, and in another one of those like zealot moments, he was on the trial for Lenny Bruce. He was one of the witnesses, so he was like, you know, I was reading in the paper about, because I think whatever they just had exonerated Lenny Bruce. You know, it was more recently that they revisited it and said, you know, there's Jules Feiffer again. It's like, motherfucker, you're everywhere.
I went to an exhibition of his work at, I can't remember whose gallery, small gallery on the east side. And Robert,
Alan,
yeah,
yeah,
that guy. And Robert Caro was there.
right.
You know, just kicking back. Robert Caro, who's been writing, you know, this massive biography of Lyndon Johnson that's been.
And the Power Broker.
And the Power Broker, which is in every Zoom, you know, backdrop. And they're just sitting back, telling each other stories, roaring with laughter. And he knew everybody. He knew everybody in every walk of culture or life.
Yeah. I hung out with him at Studs Turtle.
Wow.
Yeah.
Of course you did.
Yeah, no, anyway, you got to walk through all that and then make it to 95 and still, you know, continue working. And that's the other thing. As a guiding light when I look at, he's been that, like, you know, for my whole career, but just looking at somebody who does that and still is having a great time with it and, you know, and does it to the last breath.
Yeah.
Right, the optimism to start a
By
trilogy.
the way,
Start a
I
trilogy
should
at the end
note,
of 85.
I should note that he's had macular degeneration to such a point that I said, like, well, what do you see? He said, well, the entire middle of your face is a blur. And so when he was writing, this book that you're seeing a stack of there, he'd write it down. He said, yeah, I can't go back and edit it because I can't see it after I've written it down. And it's kind of like I'm writing extemporaneously, but I'm unable to make corrections, so you have to do that after the fact. But he was almost blind and half deaf. And
I don't know if you were there for the Symphony Space thing that he did with Roz Chast
Yes.
years ago.
Yes.
It was a beautiful moment. So this was when Killed My Mother was coming out. Roz Chast had done Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant about the dealing with her parents aging. And Francoise Moulet was moderating it and asking them both questions. And Roz is talking about her book and that she's probably at the time mid-60s, I guess. And she says, you know, having been through all this, I've just decided I'm not going to doctors anymore. You know, it's whatever happens is going to happen. I've had it. That's it for life. You know, I'll get done what I get done. Jules is 25 years older than she is, and he's sitting at the outside and he's just laughing and he's saying, I just started a trilogy. It's going to take a few years to get done.
she also said everybody should die at 75. It was like 10 years past that. And he did give her like a
So I think that's his message to all of us.
Yeah, one of the things he told me, which ties into something Karen said earlier, was he told me that he never wanted to engage in any creative work that wasn't fun. He needed to have, I mean, and by fun I think he meant joy. And he told me, you know, he wrote 2 novels. They're not good. And he hated writing.
She was told.
He hated writing. He said it was just miserable and painful to write them, and he knew they weren't that good. He knew that they were the lesser of his creative work. Right. And he attributed it, well, I mean, it's a chicken and egg question, but he did not have fun writing them. It was really just a difficult experience for him.
Yeah, I think engaging in creativity is fun, is a good way to land the plane here. We are going for the next panel, so unless Jules had anything insightful to say about kaiju in the Star Wars universe, we should probably wrap it up here. But as you can see, this is a life well worth celebrating, and I'm glad that you guys could be here with us and with some of your